I like to look at this as monitoring to breed versus monitoring to treat. When I'm doing a mite wash, I'm not doing a mite wash to determine whether or not I should treat. I'm doing a mite wash to determine whether or not I should breed for that colony. That's me. That's James Lee with his prison James bandana. I've titled the talk "Test, Breed, and Repeat." Wanted to share with folks how we're exploring and maybe even refining some processes on how to pre-screen colonies for varroa resistance by using mite washes and maybe some other methods of pre-screening that we're actively exploring. And I wanted to also kind of evaluate that in the context of the general overall messaging that we hear when it comes to monitoring for varroa using washes or any other method for that matter. And then what the predominant narrative is concerning that, the general messaging that promotes preventive treatment. So if you've ever heard me discuss it, I typically describe it as prophylactic treatment, where you're treating without necessarily determining a cause for the treatment, but you're just treating because. Or maybe there's one colony in a yard of 10 or 20, or maybe it's just five, and you perform a monitor or a wash or a sample on that particular colony, and it's high. And by proxy, you would treat the rest of the yard. There's a fancy term for that, but essentially, this is a form of prophylaxis in which you're treating based on one colony's situation versus all colony situations. So, successful varroa control solutions are proactive. They control varroa before the mites reach levels that threaten colony productivity and survival. And if you survey most information and education out there in the internet, or in manuals and extensions and various other honeybee health type messaging, you're going to find that this is a general message across the board. You'll also hear that doing nothing about varroa mites is not a practical option. For most beekeepers, honeybees are not capable of surviving or thriving unless the beekeeper prevents varroa from reaching damaging levels. So you have to treat essentially, or else you're going to lose your colonies. There's no alternatives. The implication for this is that most recommendations that we hear in education platforms or in bee club meetings or in manuals that are presented for beekeeper education is that you treat based on the season and expectation rather than waiting for the monitoring results. So that would be an example of, you monitor one colony, you find that it's high, and then you treat everyone, or it's a specific time of the year, and you could basically go to the Honeybee Health Coalition's website, and you're going to find that there's a really cool tool. It's a very helpful tool. I mean, I'm not completely knocking it, but you could utilize that tool to determine whether or not you should treat based on specific information that you feed into that particular tool. However, most of that is geared toward treatment-based interventions, not necessarily breeding for resistance or looking to the future for a particular colony. It's just making sure that the varroa load is low. I would say that this is likened to a fear-based messaging system as well, as it kind of discourages experimentation, especially with brand new beekeepers. One of the messages that I heard frequently when I first started was that, that's nice that you want to try this new alternative or revolutionary approach, or that sounds clever kind of scenario, but wait until you get a little bit of experience under your belt. You don't want to really do any experimentation until you become a good treating beekeeper. Again, I'm not knocking the idea of treatment. I'm just saying that, like, you have to learn to treat effectively first before you can become educated in these alternative methods. And for me, from an educator perspective, as an individual who thinks that people are capable of learning what they need to learn on the onset versus learning later after you've already been trained to do something, that it might be a little backwards. This might be a silly analogy, but I think of it in the context of when I was potty training my children. We tried an alternative method called infant potty training, in which you look for cues in which the infant tells you that they're getting ready to use the bathroom. If anybody here has had a child or has a child or has even diapered a child, you know that, they're usually giving you some pretty strong indicators they're getting ready to drop a deuce in their diaper. And these facial expressions, body wiggling, that sort of thing, like they're communicating. So there is a mode of communication there in which they're telling you this is about to happen. If you're training yourself to be in tune with that, you can easily train that child to use a different reservoir or a different option other than the diaper. But at the end of the day, parents get busy, and realistically, after the second, third child, this got very difficult, and we kind of reverted back to using diapers. But we trained those children to use or eliminate in those diapers. And then we untrained them a few years later and changed the messaging. Poop in your diaper is good. Now we're saying, oh, that's bad. And it's a little bit of confusing for the individual in a developmental sense, and so it's really hard for them to break that habit. Eventually they can break that habit, but it takes a while, and some children are little more stubborn or resistant than others. Excuse me. So the fear-based messaging is maybe not intentional, but it's essentially trying to get at the heart of the matter, and that varroa is a big problem for beekeepers. And if you're not doing something about it, or there's not an alternative education that's providing robust information to change these habits and methods, people are going to have to just do what the norm is. And national surveys actually show that less than half of beekeepers report conducting mite tests regularly. And again, these are more rooted in facts and observations and personal experiences than they are, accusations. Because if you go to most bee club meetings that I've experienced, and you ask everyone in the room, who's monitoring for mites, or have you monitored for mites, or do you have a monitoring program? Very few hands go up. Very few hands go up. And it's probably more about the messaging than it is actual ability or capacity. Although ability and capacity play a role, I think the predominant messaging discourages this kind of approach or monitoring approach. So the Bee Informed Partnership survey consistently shows that 30 to 40% of backyarders don't monitor for mites at all, but most still apply some form of treatment. And again, whether they're doing it correctly or not, they're doing it because they're taught to treat, that you should treat, and if you don't treat, then your bees will die. And these educational campaigns often use that language and create this fear. And then there's the fear-based narrative that frames testing as risky or optional, because I really, I hear a lot of beekeepers say, well, I don't want to kill 300 bees, or some of my, treatment-free brethren will say, what's the point in, testing? I'm not going to treat anyways. I agree with that, right? Like, if I don't want to treat, why would I waste my time killing 300 bees, or spending the time and the effort on doing it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I changed my mind on that as we go on. Also, mite thresholds are poorly communicated or ignored. There's not a lot of evidence that supports where these various thresholds originate. They started at one point way back in history when the varroa mite landed on our shores, and we developed these thresholds, and they were much, much higher for treatment threshold back then than they are now. And viruses have a lot to do with that. I won't spend a lot of time talking about that, because that's a whole entire talk in and of itself. But even when testing is discussed, the thresholds for action rarely are emphasized or understood. So, if I hit a certain point, what do I do now? And we just have a baseline in which we operate. Many beekeepers treat at the detection of any mites. If they see mites on the back of bees, they especially freak out, because they think the infestation level is so high that the mites are just crawling all over the place. So, regardless of the level, and despite research supporting threshold-based intervention, people will treat. Although, less than 3% infestation seems to be more of a norm in which you are not necessarily going to treat. If folks get 1%, 2%, 3%, usually they're treating. And when I ask folks in a room, if you have a 3% infestation, those who are actively treating are going to say, yeah, that's a point in which I would treat. And then there's peer pressure. Advice in online groups often promote treatment as a standard, right? Like, when you talk about something happened to your colony, what's the first question most people will ask? Well, I'll ask, what's your mite level? What was your mite count? as opposed to some of the other alternatives that could be causing problems with uh, bees, or new beekeepers going through the motions of learning how to be a beekeeper. The first question we generally ask is, what's your mite levels, especially if we see uncapping, or we see brood shriveled up in the cell, or we see some sort of hygienic behavior occurring. Most folks will think this is going to be varroa related, in the negative sense. And then beekeepers typically don't share test first strategies with each other, and those that do discuss test first strategies seem to be um, the minority, and they're frequently criticized or warned that it's not worth the risk, right? Like, it's not worth the risk to test all of your hives. If you have one colony that is infested, you probably should treat the rest of the yard, because they're all going to become mite bombs, and they're going to kill all of the colonies in that yard. So there's also a lack of emphasis on resistance, or generally the ecological impact that treatment has. Most educational materials fail to address long-term consequences. So we'll hear about treatment, but we won't necessarily hear about the synergistic effects of the various chemicals with other chemicals in our environment, or the long-term residual chemicals that remain in the comb. Many of you have heard all of these warnings and may be familiar with this information, but this particular component is not stressed enough when it comes to discussing treatment. And then there's the widespread availability and marketing of miticides. I can get 1, 2, 3 emails a week, especially right now as we approach the peak of varroa infestation and the reduction of brood in the colony, and the bees start to slow down their brooding, especially here in the north. We're going to see a lot of these notices for sales on treatments and bundled packages, and get those treatments on, get those medications on. Right now is the time to take action. Widespread availability of this is creating this this idea that this is just a common task. This is something that we as beekeepers are supposed to do. As a brand new beekeeper, when I first started, or even was thinking about starting as a beekeeper, one of the things I first question was like, wow, this whole treatment thing is like part of the entire process. And I was not interested in keeping bees if I had to medicate them to keep them alive. It was almost like, well, that seems backwards to me. I mean, this was my logic going into it. And initially, my hesitancy to start keeping bees was closely related to the idea that I had to apply chemicals for them to stay alive. And that's just from being, maybe an organically alternative, food-minded type person. I like to get my stuff from the farmer. I don't knock somebody who doesn't, but I would prefer to know what's going into my food and into my children and that sort of thing. Um, I'm not as strict about it as my missus is, however. I will eat McDonald's and I shouldn't. So I won't be a full hypocrite, just 90% hypocrite. Okay. So this omission allows treatment to be seen as low risk, reinforcing habitual use without testing. Again, this is about the messaging, right? So this has a lot to do with the educational aspect. I don't think it has a whole lot to do with malicious intent. So the messaging is like, this is just part of the task, so therefore you do it. And most beekeepers say, okay, yeah, this is part of beekeeping, so this is what I'm going to do. And I thought about this for a little bit, and I said, what if we required evidence of infestation before selling or purchasing treatments? Like, what if you had to present some sort of document or evidence to a vendor before they could sell you a package of Apivar, or a tub of Apigard, or a bag of Formic Pro? Like, what if you actually had to demonstrate that there's a reason or a valid necessity for this medication to be going into your honeybee colony? That would be a very significant challenge. We probably would lose a lot of beekeepers at that point, because monitoring is just not normative. It's not a commonplace practice. So some quotations that I dug up on a couple of these websites and various beekeeping education outlets. Again, these are not to condemn them. These are just part of the messaging that we're seeing in voices that are very common and very impactful and have a broad range and reach. So by monitoring colonies for mites early in the year, beekeepers can treat mite infestations before they become problematic. So this message from Penn State's extension website is essentially communicating to you that, especially for northern beekeepers, coming out of May, most beekeepers in Michigan are going to be treating. Most of them are putting treatments on first thing before the honey flow or the nectar flow starts, because you want to have those treatments in there and those mites reduced before that nectar flow starts, because you can't necessarily apply your treatments while there's a nectar flow, and most of them you cannot put on while there's a honey in the colony. An additional quote says, I recommend monitoring for mites and treating soon after honey is harvested. And in Iowa, this is usually late August or early September. So this is implying, and if you read the website and the rest of the information, it's a strong emphasis on a calendar-based approach. So you're doing this in a seasonal, scenario, a recurring schedule. Monitoring mites at least once per month, confirm that your varroa mite plan is working. So you're treating and then you're using monitoring to verify the efficacy of the treatment. You're not necessarily using the monitoring for understanding the mite load levels or if the bees are doing something with the mites. None of that. It's just to make sure that the treatments are working, because we have a problem with treatments being completely effective. Maybe even in the organic sense if they're not applied appropriately, but in the synthetic sense, some of these chemicals are just ineffective and not working as well as they used to. So you're using mite testing to confirm your management's working, not deciding whether or not to manage the mites. So what are the patterns? Testing is often described, often even required. We see it everywhere. We hear about it, and it's presented in this as a supporting role to pre-scheduled treatment. You'll hear people say test after you do a treatment. You'll hear people say test before doing a treatment, and those are all, good recommendations, especially if you apply treatment. You should test afterwards to make sure that it was efficacious. Treatment is the norm and testing is secondary. And the primary beekeeping narrative contributes to calendar-based instead of evidence-driven care. All right, these are just the patterns. These are things that are exhibited in most beekeeper education. You're free to disagree with this, but if you've heard, most presentations concerning, taking care of your colonies and their mite infestation levels and what you need to be doing as far as beekeeping is concerned with treatments, then you probably have heard this very similar pattern. I like to make sure that everybody has at least acquainted themselves to some extent with the life cycle of the varroa mite. We hear a lot about the life cycle of the honeybee. We know a lot about pupation. We know a lot about the various castes of the honeybees. We know, how long it may take a queen to pupate and when we can expect her to go out on mating flights after she emerges. We know a lot about, there's a lot of education about that. There's not a lot of emphasis on the actual reproductive cycle of the varroa mite. And for me, this is key. You need to know the life cycle of the varroa mite, because if this is your primary enemy as a beekeeper, at least for now, right? Then you need to know the life cycle of your primary enemy. You need to know your enemy so you can intervene appropriately. Otherwise, you're trapped in that very point that the narrative is getting at, is that most folks don't fully understand what they're dealing with. So they're going to give them a prescriptive, one size fits all approach to make sure that, their bees are staying alive and healthy and not impacting others or killing colonies unnecessarily. All right. So varroa mites double pretty rapidly during the brooding season. 2.8 to 5 viable female offspring per month per foundress mite. So multiply that times 100 or times 1,000, whatever your infestation level is. Each varroa mite foundress can multiply up to 5 times in a single month. And if the conditions are right, mite populations can double roughly every 3 to 4 weeks. So I know if I go into a colony, let's say I actually do a mite wash in May, and I find 8 mites, there might be more mites in the colony, but I can just do the math based on the 8 mites that, I found and assume there's others. And I could look at how that population would rapidly increase over the course of the season. And when brooding is at its peak and those perfect conditions, and there's tons of brood, especially if you've got a very broody type of honeybee, you're going to be growing a lot of varroa mites right along with your honeybees. And it just happens that the bees are able to outpace the varroa mites early and mid-season, but as the season winds down, we start to see the ramifications of the reduced brooding of the honeybee and the continuous reproduction of the varroa mite, because the varroa mite is reproducing at double the speed, whereas the honeybee is only producing one pupa per one bee per cell, right? Okay. All right, so here are some of the options and testing solutions. And so this is what we're going to get at. This is the thrust of the presentation here. These are the various options that are usually discussed when it comes to monitoring for your varroa mites and doing checks on your varroa mites. The testing solutions, we have alcohol, dish soap, powdered sugar, and CO2. Okay. I have experience with all four of these different types of solutions. I can't say that I've used the CO2 or the powdered sugar shake particularly to monitor for varroa because I determined way early on, as far as CO2 is concerned, and actually using it in apitherapy and knocking out honeybees and actually seeing, how varroa mites respond to the CO2. They don't always dislodge from the honeybees, and I don't feel like it's a economical approach. CO2 is expensive. One single cartridge is, like $3 now. If you can buy a case of little BB cartridges. Again, it's just not. To me, it's not worth the cost. So it's not a method that I utilize, or I probably wouldn't recommend utilizing this method either, especially because it's just not consistent. The powdered sugar shake, from an alternative minded beekeeping perspective, I felt like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea because I'm not going to kill the bees. So if you're worried about killing the bees, this is usually where most beekeepers would kind of find identity with, okay, well, if I'm going to monitor, I'm going to do the most humane way. But it's, been revealed in most instances that the powdered sugar shake is pretty aggressive on the bees, and it actually can just kill them eventually anyways. And most of them, once they get back into the colony, they may expire anyways. So it's not really, again, it's not really worth it. And again, sugar is not cheap. Sugar keeps going up and up and up too. So not really interested in this method for myself. Some beekeepers may find that it works for them. I would say between this and CO2, powdered sugar is probably going to be a little more reliable. So if you want to look at degree of efficacy, you're increasing your efficacy at that point. Isopropyl alcohol, there's various solutions. There's 70%, there's 80%, 90%. The higher that you go, obviously the more effective it is going to be at killing or dislodging the varroa through the mode of desiccation, like just killing it so it lets go off of the plates of the honeybee workers. But again, it's also expensive, and during COVID and the pandemic, it became much more expensive. And um, if I'm doing 10 colonies, I'm wasting alcohol every 2 colonies, maybe sometimes 1 colony, especially if the alcohol gets really, really dirty. And then, it's wasteful and it's toxic and you toss it on the ground. Some people say, well, you shouldn't use it because it's flammable. You got a smoker laying around. I've never been able to effectively set rubbing alcohol on fire, but I'm sure I could find a way if I tried. And knowing me, if you know me and my beekeeping, or you've ever been in the bee yard with me, I will find a way to set something on fire. Wouldn't be the first time. Which reminds me, I should put a fire extinguisher in the back of the truck. Keep telling myself I'm going to do that. And so then we have we have Dawn dish soap, which is more of a recent iteration on utilization for monitoring for varroa mites, and this is what I use. Okay, I should have put the recipe in here, but if you're not familiar with the recipe for the Dawn dish soap, I'll share that with you at the end. But you can also look it up. We're going to talk about Randy Oliver and some scientific beekeeping highlights from his website, and the solution that I use is based on his recipe. So let's talk about Randy Oliver. He did a study. I could, probably find ways to discuss this, but it's just better to iterate some of the points that he's already demonstrated because he does it so effectively. He wanted to find a way to, compare these different sampling methods and find out which one is more accurate so that beekeepers can make better decisions. They use the different sampling methods that we just described, and wanted to evaluate the varying mite recovery rates. And when we say mite recovery rate, we're discussing how many varroa you actually find in the bottom of the sample cup that you're using to do your check. The testing helps determine which methods consistently capture a representative portion of the actual mite load in the colony. So we wanted to know which approach, or he wanted to know which approach is going to be the most effective way to determine, like, this is what the actual infestation level is, because again, all these different methods and different approaches can create a varying result. And then if you have an inaccurate sample, you would get either a false sense of security, yay, 0 mites in my wash, I don't have to treat, or there's no reason to treat them, or you may actually get a poor sample and there's more than your threshold and it's an unnecessary treatment based on the information. Either way, we wanted to try to find, or he wanted to try to find the most consistent approach, right? All right. So the methods comparison and standardization. So what's the effectiveness? How many mites are dislodged per method? What's the consistency? How often can this be repeated? Um, and then how easy is it to use, right? I don't like using the alcohol. Again, it's an expense thing and I have to carry around a bunch of them. If I'm doing 50 colonies, I could go through a couple of those little tiny bottles really fast, right? So for me, it's about pennies on the dollar more than anything. We also want to know what the control variables are, right? So he looked at the different techniques, the time and the materials, sample size, how many bees, what agitation time was necessary, and then what concentration of the various detergents or solutions was he using. And so, we eliminated the variables of the powdered sugar and the CO2. These weren't part of the experiment that he performed. He just primarily compared the alcohol to the sugar because alcohol was pretty much, or I'm sorry, alcohol to the dish soap because alcohol tends to be the most recommended industry standard when it comes to sampling. So he wanted to empower practical decision making. Know when treatment's truly necessary. Track your trends over time. So we're not just doing this in August. We're not just doing this in May. We're doing this on a consistent, regular basis to establish trends because what we're looking for is data driven decisions that we can rely on instead of calendar based treatments. Because, and I'll share this with you as we go on, when we're just relying on a specific calendar based decision making, we might be missing the boat on our breeding opportunities. So support for treatment-free and IPM approaches. Again, these are Randy's findings and Randy's impetus, and Randy has a really great presentation. If you're familiar with the SBGMI YouTube channel, you could go on the SBGMI YouTube channel and you could find his presentation on mite-resistant breeding mite-resistant bees, and the approach that he's taken using some of these principles, especially when it comes to monitoring and using these samples to make breeding decisions. If you have an accurate sample, you're able to more effectively take a integrated pest management approach for sustainable and low treatment beekeeping. You reduce your cost for treatments, you increase your potential for selecting better bees for breeding. It also allows beekeepers to breed from those colonies and maybe even identify mite resistant and survival traits in those colonies and continue to propagate those. So there's no fancy bells and whistles necessary here. And one of the things that Randy had spoke about was, the reason for this is to show that you don't need fancy tools to raise resistant bees. And, his primary focus was to show that you could do it just by open mating and not even have to worry about, the investment in time and education requirements of instrumental insemination. So, to summarize, varroa mite loads are a major concern in honeybee colony health. Mite wash sampling provides an estimate of infestation when you're using nurse bees. Randy Oliver tested sampling consistency and efficacy of Dawn dish soap versus alcohol, and he was seeking to identify a reliable, safe, and cost effective mite wash method. All right, so he compared the release agents of alcohol, Dawn dish soap, and the sugar shake. He used a half cup bee sample, monitored the percent of mites that detached in 60 seconds. Dawn Ultra, which he used lemon scented, I guess. I used the non scented. I haven't done a study to see if the scent has any impact, but this is what he used. Was diluted for the trial. He used the swirl method instead of vigorous shaking, especially with the dish soap, which is important because the dish soap gets sudsy, to reduce damage to the bees. His target was at least a 95% recovery within 60 seconds. So he wanted to do this within a minute per colony. So you're not spending a bunch of time waiting for mite drops and doing counts. The alcohol wash was inconsistent depending on agitation and bee density. So there was variables that were playing a role in the ability to get this goal that he was targeting. The Dawn showed a consistent 93 to 96% recovery with just light swirling. And the sugar shake had a lower and less reliable recovery at 70 to 80%. Dawn matched or outperformed alcohol in the recovery rate and required only 60 seconds of soaking and a light swirl to dislodge mites. I'm going to add a personal caveat here. As I use the Dawn dish soap, I found personally that I just give it just a tiny swirl. Sometimes because I'm getting frustrated and this is just a personal problem, I'm not seeing any mites dropping. I might give it a little bit more of an agitation, thinking maybe that's going to help. But at the end of the day, usually 1 minute is proven to be very effective. It doesn't take long, and then I can move on to the next sample. It's cost effective, it's non-flammable, and it's widely available. One bottle of Dawn dish soap, let's say $7, makes you a lot of mite wash solution for at least a season or two. Um, and it's simple, you just soak, swirl, and count. Randy uses a mirror. He places the mirror up under the bottom of the cup so he can see without having to hold the cup up, which I would say is probably a great idea. But I'll lose the mirror, so I just don't even bother trying to pack a mirror out into the yard. All right, where do you sample from? Now, this is important. Again, I won't spend a lot of time laboring this. Randy's did a really good job on discussing the various places in which you could take a sample from. And the link for that article is down at the bottom of the page here. The article was called "Reevaluating Varroa Monitoring," and it's a whole series which was published in ABJ as well as on the website, Randy's website. And so essentially, he said if your goal is to obtain a consistent and representative sample from the adult bee infestation um, rate, shake it from a drawn or honeycomb free of brood, but adjacent to the brood nest. So off to the side of the brood nest, whether it's in the first box, second box, third box of the brood nest, this is what he's saying. Pick a consistent approach and stick with it. Some folks like to do it directly in the brood nest. Uh, Sometimes there's not always a good frame to choose and you need to get a sample. It's not always the best approach, but at least you're getting a sample. But some folks find that, at least what I was taught initially is that you take a frame that had open brood on it because it's assumed that the nurse bees that are walking around on that frame also are going to have varroa that are waiting to crawl into those particular um, uh, cells once the brood reaches that point in which mites infest it. So either way, pick the same method for each colony each time and stick with it so you have a consistent approach to your sampling method. Okay, so this comes to the point of the discussion. Last year, a group of us, uh, beekeepers associated with the SBGMI and Corey Stevens decided that we were going to look at some samples in his mite-resistant colonies and also do some mite washes on those mite-resistant colonies. And my theory initially was that resistant mites or colonies that are surviving treatment free or untreated are probably carrying varroa loads at a normal level, and that the thresholds probably weren't accurate, right? 2%, 3%, that sort of thing. I was expecting, or at least hypothesizing, that we were going to see that these colonies that are surviving year over year, treatment free, are also carrying significant mite loads, or maybe even just tolerating them. And that would be an ideal situation, right? If you had mite population, honeybee populations that could tolerate the mites. But as you'll see here, the data kind of supported a different conclusion. All right, just to share a little bit about the Harbo scores that we did. So if you're not familiar with the Harbo assay, maybe many of you are, but the Harbo assay is a brood evaluation in which you remove a frame of emerging brood or close to emerging brood, and you evaluate the mites that are inside the cells with the pupa, and you score them based on your findings. Okay, so we did Harbo assays on all of these colonies at Corey's place, but we also did an evaluation based on the data supported provided by other beekeepers that were part of this initiative. So there's, I think, five different beekeepers that provided data from their colonies in 3 different states, and we use that data to do a comparison. So you look at sample A here, you have the overall percentage distribution of Harbo scores of colonies that we sampled in Corey's yard, Corey Stevens from Stevens Beco. Okay, and in his yard, he raises varroa resistant honeybees, so VSH, and he's been doing this for quite a number of years. And he sells queens and provides stock to other beekeepers. And many of you may be familiar with him. If you're not, you could look him up at Stevens Beco. All right. So these colonies in his yard that we sampled, we did a total of 41 samples. We also conducted mite washes along with these Harbo assays. Okay. And it's interesting because I talk about this in greater detail at a different talk, that I did a similar approach of evaluation, but doing mite washes as well as Harbo assays on colonies that I was raising in Michigan versus the colonies that we were evaluating in the other states. And so if you see here on this side on A, There were 41 colonies that were evaluated. Now, here's a caveat that Corey would like for me to make sure that you all are aware of, is that not all of the colonies that we evaluated were his stock. Some of the stock was experimental stock that was part of the yard. And I'm going to get to a point about that here in a second too. But we found that out of all the colonies that we evaluated, there was a high degree of colonies that scored 4 on the Harbo assay, which we would liken to 100% VSH. All right. And what's interesting is that through these open mated methods, that is different than instrumental insemination. When you're using breeder queens that have concentrated genetics, we found through open mating approaches that I had a similar occurrence of Harbo 4 in the yard. So there was a pretty high concentration of those high scoring VSH genetics. So it is possible in a small breeding scheme. So that's really what the point of this is that you can do this with instrumental insemination. You can do this with open mating as well, which is similar to what Randy was emphasizing in his efforts. Okay. And so then this next slide, we took all of the samples from all of the different beekeepers, okay? And there was 161 total samples. On the left side, we excluded Corey's scores, and on the right side, we included Corey's scores. All right, so this left side shows what open mating schema looks like with the various beekeepers that were involved and the level of scores that we achieved or were able to identify when we did these evaluations in the fall. So this was August or late summer, August, September. And we were evaluating these colonies. We found about 40% of the colonies that were evaluated in the non-breeder yard were scoring 40%, or scoring 4 at a rate of 40%, which is pretty good. Again, this is the open mating scheme. If we go back to including Corey's samples and this total of 161 colonies, that rate went up to 43.5%. So it's a little bit of an increase when you look at the open mating versus comparing or including, an established breeder who's been doing this for a long time versus a few folks that have just gotten started over the last few years and making progress. And what this does say is that it's not a futile effort for you to start breeding your own bees now, especially if you're only using an open mating scheme. All right, so this next slide shows what this looks like if we removed all the colonies that did not belong in Corey's yard, that were not his bees. We just specifically looked at his bees that were a product of his breeding efforts. And the overall distribution of Harbo scores in that sample size from Corey's yard at 41 samples was 87.5%. It's like 88% of his colonies were scoring significantly high on the Harbo scale. It was a 4, which is 100% VSH. All right. And then only 12.5% scored 3. So they were either 3s or 4s. So it just shows that, that instrumental insemination really kicked it up a notch in his example. But that also that his selection methods and the protocols that he's using when you use the Harbo assay to select is also very effective. Okay. So then there's the percentage distribution of Harbo scores in his stock only. I'm sorry, I just described the other side. That was in his breeders only. On this right side on your screen would be all of his bees. So 67% of all of his bees, 87% of those that were inseminated that were designated breeders only. Like we knew those were breeder stock candidates that were tested. I hope that makes sense because I just totally botched all that. All right. So let's do a risk assessment, okay? Let's take a look at the data that came out of that effort. I'm going to revisit this just briefly here. So this is from the Honeybee Health Coalition, and it emphasizes when mite levels are above 1 to 3% that you should apply a mite control immediately using a proven effective seasonally appropriate treatment control method. Now remember what I said, like this is a calendar-based narrative. Essentially monitoring is always part of the discussion, but it's never the primary reason for engaging in anything but treatment. So the control options are typically by seasonal phase. At one point there was, I can't remember the entity that did it, but there was a newsletter or a release of information stating that, if you have a 1% infestation in the spring, that you should just go ahead and treat. And so that's when I would go back to some of our treatment-free brethren. it would say, why are you going to bother monitoring if you're not going to treat? At this point, why are you bothering monitoring if you're just going to treat? Like, there's no point. If you're at a 1% infestation, most colonies are going to be carrying that to some degree, because 1% is not a lot of varroa mites in a sample of 300. So if you got a 1% infestation and you're gonna treat, then don't bother, right? Just treat them, right? If that's going to be your approach, don't waste your time. I would agree with you. You're just wasting time. So if you look at the table here on the right, it talks about the various phases. So there's a good chart at the Honeybee Health Coalition. They do have a handy booklet that shows you the various phases in which the varroa mites and the honeybee colonies kind of or the honeybee reproduction kind of intersect at the peak of the season. If you've ever been at Randy Oliver's website, or you've looked at his um, what do you call that? His treatment tool. I can't remember what that thing, the calculator tool he uses, a spreadsheet. You can put in, when to treat based on the mite infestations. You'll see where the peaks occur. And for us in the north, or in more northern latitudes, you're going to see that level in which those crosses right about now in July. As the brooding goes down, the mite population goes up. So these various phases, dormant would obviously be in the fall, population increase is going to be in the spring, peak population is going to be, mid to late June through July, and then population decrease is going to be August through October, and trending downward from there, because then our bees just, stop brooding almost altogether. And so these prompt control methods all fall within 1 to 3%, right? So between 1 and 3%, you're treating. But it also says, between 1 and 2%, immediate control is not needed. So I guess this goes back to that idea of the mixed messaging. Here at 2% in the spring, and then 2% in the late summer, I'm treating. But at peak population, 3% I'm treating, and 2% I can, so if I'm following these protocols, for me, I'm like, I understand why people just go ahead and treat, because it's straining at gnats. All right. So let's look at this in the big picture for folks that need a little help visualizing. 2% infestation, right? Low risk. This is what I'm going to categorize as a low risk for me and for the approach that we're discussing today. This 2% infestation is a low risk, and this is based on the information from the study we did with the bees down at Corey's place and our colonies that we did in Michigan and Missouri and Virginia. The low 2% threshold is August, late summer. All right. We're not talking about May. We're not talking about June or July. We're talking about late summer. So at 2%, we're looking at low infestation. In a sample of 300 bees or less or more, it's only 6 mites. Okay. You're only finding 6 mites in the sample. That's a 2% infestation. Now we're going to talk about a medium level of threat or risk. It's a 3%. 3% infestation in a sample of 300 bees or more or less, you're going to have 9 mites. So that's what 3% infestation looks like. 9 varroa mites in your sample. This is probably more for me than anybody else, because math is hard. So 4% is a higher risk. We're starting to escalate in our risk category. In a sample of 300, give or take, there could be 301, there could be 320 bees in the colony, but for sake of consistency, we're going to assume that sample and a half a cup of bees is going to be about 300 bees. So 12 mites, that's a 4% infestation. And now we're looking at the danger zone, 5% infestation rate. A sample of 300 bees is 15 mites. So once we hit that 5%, for me particularly, that's when I've assumed, based on my beekeeping practice and what I've been doing the last few years when it comes to selection, is that 5% rate it's a red flag. And that's not just something that I randomly concocted. This is based on information from some study and research in Germany, and Ralph Buchler, however you would like to say his name, a researcher at the University of Kirchhain, who's now retired. His findings, between 5 and 8%, those colonies are still able to survive, but the potential for survival becomes much, much lower. And at 10%, those colonies, really, you need to do something with that, or you should probably treat them or euthanize them, depending on whatever approach it is that you're taking to your beekeeping management and philosophy. Okay, so these are the 5 beekeepers that were involved in this study, I guess you could say, this project, this experiment. And this is essentially a chart that was derived from the information that we got during that project when we took all the scores from all the colonies that were evaluated and put them together and came up with this. Right, so what you see is this trend line, this little red dotted line going across the bars here. That shows where there's a lot of like it's a common score across the range of the various entry points. And so what I want everybody to know is that the Harbo score here at the bottom from 0 to 4 is what we got when we did the Harbo assay. And then the numbers on the left side here going up to the top, those are going to be how many mites were in the sample, or the average mite sample. Okay, and so what you see here is all the Harbo scores in these white boxes and the average of the samples. So, there were 2.9, 6.0, 6.9, 12.1. Those are the mites that were in those samples, okay? All right, so let's look at the categorization of the low risk threshold. So at 2% mite wash, we found that there was a strong correlation between a Harbo score of 3 and a Harbo score of 4. So at 2% infestation, I have colonies that are scoring high on 3 and 4. We're also getting colonies that score at 2, some at 1, and some at 0. That 2% threshold still goes across the board, and there's still samples that were not resistant, but a greater degree of colonies were resistant, if you could see that here. All right, and then we're going to look at that medium risk level at 3% infestation. And this point is where most people are going to say, that's it, dude, you're going too far. We need to treat that colony. At 3%, you are probably subjecting negating scores of 2, 3, and 4. So we're still getting some samples at 4, some samples at 3, more so at 2, more at 1, and some zeros. Okay, but we're getting 1s and 2s now, so we're reducing the likelihood of high VSH or high mite resistance based on the Harbo assay. All right, so now we're looking at this. Okay, we're approaching the danger zone. It's getting pretty high here, and I've got a 4% infestation. I'm still getting scores all across the board. I'm still getting 4s, 3s, 2s, but I'm getting more 1s. I'm getting more zeros now. And at 5, it was just an extremely low correlation with higher scores and a much higher correlation with lower scores. So more zeros and 1s at the 5% infestation rate. But that 5% infestation rate still had some 4, some 3, some 2. Like, so you still have some of those occurrences. Again, it's not hard and fast data to say without, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I know for a fact if I wash this, it's going to be this on the Harbo assay. What it's saying is that there's a strong correlation with higher scores at lower mite washes. All right, so this is just I wish I had better pictures, but this is what I use when I am doing mite treatment or mite monitoring. I like to look at this as monitoring to breed versus monitoring to treat. When I'm doing a mite wash, I'm not doing a mite wash to determine whether or not I should treat. I'm doing a mite wash to determine whether or not I should breed from that colony. Okay, and if treatment becomes a necessity at a later point when it crosses that threshold that I've established as the treatment threshold for my apiaries and myself, then that's when I'm going to unfortunately employ the chemicals or engage in some sort of IPM approach where I split those colonies down and I requeen them, or whatever approach I'm able to do based on that seasonal situation, right? Because you can't essentially raise a bunch of new queens in August in Michigan. You're just going to have very low mating success, and your colonies need to start preparing for winter. So some of our IPM approaches are limited at that juncture. So I take one of these tubs. This is actually a candy making tub that I bought from what do you call candy makers? I can't remember what you call them, but it was a candy maker that was going out of business, and they sold all their tubs. So I carry this around. I can actually fit these vinegar jugs that I filled with the dishwash solution, which is 1 gallon of water and a full tablespoon of Dawn dish soap. So you use, I'm sorry, see, I'm messing up the solution. It's a 1 tablespoon for each half gallon of water. So this is a 1 gallon jug. All right, and it's 2 tablespoons of dish soap that go into there. And I usually go a little bit heavier on the dish soap, but I don't think you need to. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but you do need to have enough of the dish soap in the solution for it to be effective. And then I use the Ceracell. I do still use the Easy Checks from Vito Pharma, I think, distributes those. You can get those free at uh, bee conferences and such. So obviously, if they're free, why not use them? But they tend to leak at a much higher rate than the cells. But the cells, they leak too. But the point is that you're at least using it, and even if it is leaking a little bit, it's still effective. And then I take the bees off the frame that I use and I shake them down into this tub. And if you haven't found the queen, it can be a little risky because you might wash her in the mite wash. Sometimes I can't find her, so I will shake the bees off into that tub, and I'll take the tub and I'll shake that tub and kind of let the bees sift themselves, and then watch their behavior. If the queen is in there, and most of the time I find the queen if she is in there, you'll see her because they will behave very differently as if the queen is not in there. They will walk up the sides and they will start fanning and make a lot of racket if you shake those nurse bees down in there, and the queen is not in there. Additionally, this shaking method also allows the workers and the drones to dislodge and fly off, so they're not contaminating or impacting the sample negatively. So and then I flip the tub over and then I run the cup up the sides and I take my half cup sample with a little bit of extra bees on it because they're going to fly off as you move them to the sample cup, and then I dump them in. All right, so this is a way in which I have started recording what my counts are. I've been using the blue painter's tape on the back of the boxes because I used to use a notebook, but sometimes you're just moving too fast. And I found that if I am busy or I'm trying to hurry, I won't write it down, and then I'm losing that data because I don't write it down. I just tell myself, oh, I'll remember that, but I never remember. It's just like I'll hide stuff from the kids and I tell myself, I'll remember that I put it there, and then I don't remember. So I've hid it for myself and not the kids. Um, so just kind of par for the course these days. But this what I have here is the date. I marked that as Queen Plus, and that I saw her, and then I marked her in this sample. This particular colony, I actually took a sample from two different boxes. Because the first sample in box 3 only had one mite or two mites in the wash, so that's what M1 means. And then M the second one is M2. I didn't write that on there. Was 0. So I washed the same sample twice, which is this is where the cost efficacy of the dish soap comes into handy, because I don't feel bad dumping that dish soap onto the ground, and I can put new dish soap into the cup with the bee sample in it and wash them again to make sure that I got all the mites off the sample. And so I wanted to find out, just like, am I fooling myself with this colony? I felt like the mite infestation should have been higher. So then I scored another box and I found 0 mites in that box too. So I feel pretty confident that the mite load in this colony in July, near the end of July, is pretty low. Even though there's still brood in the colony, if there's an excessive amount of varroa, they're going to be on those nurse bees as well as in the brood. Not every single solitary mite in a colony in July is going to be just in the brood. The number is going to be much lower in July than it will be in August, but this is a good start. So I have something to gauge my next sample on. Okay, so based on the graph and the information that we got through the little experiment that we did, we found that 2% mite wash isn't an indicator of resistance. So you can't just say, well, I got a 2% mite wash, therefore this is a resistant colony. It just means that the mite population at that time was lower, and it's proof that there's probably need for an assay to quantify the results. If you want to learn how to do a Harbo assay, we did a production with Corey 2 years ago. It's on James Lee's Bees on my YouTube channel. There's also a class on how to do a Harbo assay on the SBGMI website. If you go to the Bee School, there's a video class and questions and a test that you could take to reinforce your knowledge. Dispersed mite population can be low, like we just talked about. Errors in the washes are a direct result of a disproportion between the brood and the dispersal phase. So that count that I have in July, even those are all zeros, it just means that there's probably a low number of mites walking around on the bees or with the bees. So there could be an error in my wash data. So again, you got to be more diligent and purposeful when you're evaluating for resistance, or you're making breeding decisions based on this information. So it's important to take that into consideration. I feel confident about that colony, but with some circumspect, right? I want to reevaluate them again and see what they're doing, because if that count's still low in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to feel really good about that colony's outlook for the fall. Okay. Then all I got to worry about is food, right? I don't have to necessarily worry about treatments. Is the labor cost, so is it worth seeking resistant colonies more or less than allowing natural selection to do the work for you? There's a lot of work involved in this process when you're doing assays, you're doing mite washes, you're recording data, you're making decisions, you're splitting, those sort of things. Is the labor cost do great for you to make those decisions? Or does it cost more if you just let everybody die and then breed from the survivors? That's a decision every beekeeper has to make for themselves. Letting all the colonies die and then breeding from survivors is probably going to be the most quickest, efficient way. But at the same time, it's not necessarily going to be efficient for you. It might be efficient for the bees and nature when it comes to selection, but it's not efficient for you because dead bees can't make honey and dead bees don't make money, right? Resistant colonies don't keep the mite levels at or near zero. I wanted to say that, when we went down there, like, oh, hey, look, there's like, 10% infestation, and it's clear that they score high on the Harbo assay. That simply wasn't the case. I wasn't disappointed because the information that we got actually reinforced what a lot of other beekeepers are seeing and other minds that are doing this kind of work are also seeing. So it kind of reinforces the notion that we're on the right track. And if you're following these protocols, you're going to continue to make these decisions overall for all beekeepers. It's going to be a net positive benefit for all of us. But even colonies that are varroa resistant showed that they had some mites in the wash. And for those that aren't aware of how the Harbo assay works, those mites might be non-reproductive. They're still going to be in the colony until they die, or are removed when they die or become injured. And at that point, they may still show up in those washes. So just because you see one or two mites, or there might be a 1% infestation, doesn't mean that it's needing treatment. It means that the mites in that colony might be sterile or infertile. The overall implications is that there is a threshold effect. So significant reductions in the mite levels are observed at higher Harbo scores, 2, 3, and 4, which means that's the threshold where resistance becomes more effective. Like we're seeing a higher degree of resistance at those scores. There could be some false positives. If you get a score of a 1 or a 0, or you get a score of 0, 1, or 2, that might be for other reasons. And, you could score a 4 and there might be for other reasons as well. But this is one of the best tools that we got to make those choices. Breeding priorities should be traits associated with scores of 3 or more. I like to breed from 4s or better. I think that's a good practice. 3s look really good in my apiaries and they survive without treatment as well. And sometimes they look better than the 4s because the 4s have a much higher degree of this trait of hygiene and brood removal, or whatever traits that they're encompassing to keep the mites low. So sometimes they're not as broody as you would see in the 3s, but then again, it just depends on a lot of different factors that are happening throughout the course of the season. If you don't have a 4 or 3, and all you're getting are 1s and 2s, obviously continue to propagate because you want to continue to add those traits to the bees in your apiary. You might have to treat them, but you want to continue to raise more bees from those ones that are showing 1 or 2, and then you'll have 3 and 4 if you keep at it. Beekeepers can use the Harbo scores as a predictive tool for varroa mite infestation levels and focus on colonies with higher scores for long-term mite control strategies. So instead of thinking about how many treatments I need to purchase at the next North American Honeybee Expo and prepare for the next season, I could start thinking about how many more boxes I need because I'm continuing to breed better bees and I don't know what to do with them all, right? Um, with that, I also want to make a plea with you if you're interested in helping us, if you're familiar with the Northern Queen Initiative, of which I'm a participant, as well as several other beekeepers here in the North, that we're trying to raise some money to increase our ability to help educate and train other beekeepers, but as well as buy crucial equipment to continue the efforts with raising resistant bees and making them available to other beekeepers. We would love to raise $10,000 this season so that we could purchase the appropriate equipment and get a couple of queen stations and insemination equipment for our beekeepers, but also train other beekeepers to use this equipment and send them off to training and get them equipment as well. And this doesn't necessarily just mean Michigan beekeepers. This could be other beekeepers that are interested in participating in the program or starting a program in their states and following some of the successful protocols that we've employed. It is a 501c3 charity, so it is a tax-deductible donation. If you want to go to the website at the SBGMI, you can find a link on the front page, or you could use this link here. Again, those are tax deductible. With that, are there any questions? I'm done. I asked you for money and I gave you information. I'll look to the chat here and see if I can find anything. James said, I thought this was treatment free. James, are you still here? I don't see you.
I'm still here, yeah. You want me to turn my camera on? Can you hear me?
No, you don't have to turn your camera on. Yeah, so you know, the approach to monitor and to do assays. Hi, James. Um, I don't I don't treat prophylactically, and the colonies that I have evaluated for resistance and show and demonstrate resistance aren't treated either. Some colonies might receive a treatment based on their thresholds, or they're removed from the program completely. But you know, the first 3 years I kept all my colonies, maybe 4 years, I think all my colonies 100% treatment free and actually maintained about 65-70% survival. And since then, you know, I've treated maybe a handful of colonies. I'd say about 20% of my total operation, which can be about 100 colonies at any given time, um, in the last couple of years.
Well, I know you talked about breeding and raising queens, and I know that you have queens available that are supposed to be better strains as such. And really, in my mind, it's the queen, it's the queen that is the issue with the ability of the colony to maintain a low mite count. If the queen doesn't have it, then the rest of the bees don't matter. And so I know that Randy Oliver, he would, I know you're raising queens, and I know that in his situation, he would pinch the queens, treat the colony, and then use those bees, which have no ability to raise a new queen. They put a new queen in there, and then he would evaluate as the new bees emerge in the next.
No, yeah, I would
You
100%.
know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah, recommend requeening
I
over treatment.
yeah, treating and treating and treating for survival. I mean, it's just something for me. It's like all, treat. I don't believe that there's any such thing as treatment free, but I think that how you use your treatments are important. So that's kind of my comment.
Yeah, selective and reduced treatment. I would agree. We would agree. Yep.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was talking about that the other day, and really finding a management technique that works with, or a treatment that works with your management technique, how your bees, adapt to the environment around you, and when's the best time to treat them, and how the bees are going to work with those treatments.
Yep. Cool. Thank you. I
And
appreciate you coming.
I do have another question
Sure.
for you, Jim. On your queens, I mean, how are you evaluating your queens before you release them for sale and distribution around? Are you thoroughly evaluating the brood pattern and the quality of the queen to be totally, fertile and laying a good brood pattern?
Are you talking about on the breeder stock that we recently sold?
Yes.
Yeah, so the breeder stock was selected based on the mothers and the drone donors. And so the queens were raised from survivor stock that was tested high on the Harbo assay, that showed good temperament, showed good brood patterns, and showed productivity, right? And then the same for the drones, came from the same types of colonies that scored high and had good temperament. Primarily focused for the drones was the good temperament and high on the Harbo score. And so the queens, when they were released, were evaluated on whether, so the not yet layers were released, and that's a risk you assume at that point. That's why they're called not yet laying. That's a choice that the customer makes. That's unfortunately the par for the course when it comes to purchasing breeder queens that aren't laying yet. As far as the queens that were demonstrated as proven laying, as soon as they established a brood pattern, and were shown that they were laying and they were laying worker brood, that's when they were selected and sent off and shipped. So Um, as far as evaluating them, and guaranteeing that there's a high degree of resistance, that's hard to do unless you winter them. So, the nature of breeder queens, especially those that have been inseminated, um, if you can get a season or two out of those, that's great. Some people can get longer, but the risk just goes up with those inseminated queens.
Right. Right.
Did I answer your question?
No, not really, but well, I'm coming from a kind of different, old school category. I mean, for years and years and years and years, we always talked about, well, if you need it, if you're raising queens, grafting queens, however you're raising your queens, you're selling queens, the queen should have a period of, what I call proofing, to where they
Oh, yeah, I'm mated stock.
prove
Yeah,
that you can
100%.
actually
If
prove
I
that
sell
it's
you a mated queen, she's been laying for 3 weeks. I don't sell nukes until the queens have been laying at least for 3 weeks.
yeah, but the thing is the industry's leading toward this, hey, I've got an, you know, uh instrumentally inseminated queen for you here, and she's gonna be famous, she's gonna be awesome, but that queen has no track record of having performed after being instrumentally inseminated. There's
Yep.
no proof that she can lay eggs and that the bees will accept her and raise brood. And there are a lot of so-called breeders out there that are selling queens for three, four, $500. And, you know, I'm just saying I don't support that. I think that, if I was to listen to the our forefathers in beekeeping and the guys that, figured it out before we tried to reinvent it, they wouldn't be purchasing queens from another person that didn't have some kind of proof of being a viable laying and productive queen. So I just
I
think
would not disagree
part
with
of
you. Yeah.
that's a part of the market that I really struggle with. People think that they've got these awesome queens. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not going to buy something and put it in my bee yard, and if it's unproductive, you tell me, oh well, that's
Well,
the way.
somebody asks me what can I guarantee about the queen? The only thing I can guarantee you is live arrival, right? I can also guarantee you the selection methods and protocols that were employed to make that queen. After that, it's bees do bee things. But if you look at the prevalence and availability of queens in the market today, I can assure you that the selection protocols are much more stringent when it comes to
Oh,
selecting for
I'm
mite.
not disagreeing
Well,
with
hold on a
that. I'm
second. Hold on a
disagreeing.
second.
Yeah.
Hold on,
Okay.
hold on a second. The selection for mite resistance compared to the broader industry and the queen availability, we have to start somewhere. We
Well,
can't.
I agree, and
Okay.
I got okay. So let's set that aside because I think we had that discussion. I honestly believe it's been what, 25 years or more that we have been trying to deal with mites and varroa and genetics and improving our bees over and over, and we're all buying better improved bees, Harbo genetics, the VHS, and and all the different types. I run a lot of pole lines in my bee yard. I have very minimal mite problems in my bee yards with my pole lines. But after 25 years of all these genetics, and we just keep putting these genetics out there and out there and out there and out there. So I would like to believe that we're moving to a higher level of mite control. Am I wrong in thinking that? I mean, it just seems that a lot of the talk is that we haven't advanced at all, and I believe that we have. I believe that there are a lot of good bees out there, and there's a lot of people are doing a lot of good things like yourself. You're doing some wonderful things. That's why I'm here listening to what you
Yeah,
do.
I think more people
you
are
know
doing it.
and
Yeah,
I
I think.
just think that the quality of our bees are better. We need to understand that the quality of our bees are better, and if we can better understand how they're dealing with that through doing the testing, not prophylactically treating, and managing the bees that are the good bees out there. I think we've been doing it so long now that we're moving in the right direction. That's That's all I had to say.
I agree with you. Yeah, and I think that that's part and reason why I wanted to give this presentation, so people can see that, even in the minimal effort that's been made in just a few short years, there's been a lot of progress in my own apiary, and it's also because I've built a lot of what I'm doing on what others have successfully done as well. And the more of us that are providing stock for others to build off of, we shorten that curve for everybody. It's not just the individual breeder who is kind of out there the wild wild west by himself distributing queens. It's lots and lots and lots of other beekeepers also breeding and selecting, even if they only have 5 colonies. Getting those genetics into the stratosphere, if you will, is very important. Very important.
I
I
agree, and I
appreciate.
thank you for what you're doing and all that you're doing.
Thanks.
I think that that's wonderful. I think that we are moving in the right direction. I think there's a lot of positive in the beekeeping world. In my world, beekeeping is fun, and I'm glad that people are out there doing the right things, putting the effort, and I think we're moving in the right direction.
Right. Thanks. I appreciate you being here, James. Good name.
Well, we'll talk. We'll talk.
All right, for sure.
Okay.
Deb Hewitt mentioned Robert Underwood said when she was at University of Pennsylvania, she found the sugar roll killed the mark bees within days as compared to controls. I think that was kind of what I was making my points from. I remember that discussion and her talking about that. But and for me, the sugar shake, it's messy, man. I just don't like all that sugar all over there, and I just think about all that sugar getting into everything. It's an OCD thing, maybe. I just don't like it. Amber says the makers of the Varroa Easy Check promote the alcohol wash or other liquid of choice over the other methods. Yeah, well, I would agree with that. Ruth said she uses the Joy Ultra Lemon scented and she prefers the Cell wash kit. Yeah, again, I don't if the lemon has anything to do with it. I haven't made a qualified comparison, but I use the Ultra for that. Dawn Ultra. CJ said he pulls samples from older mixed brood with good results and uses a Talenti gelato container. What is that? What is Talenti gelato?
So it's a brand of ice cream that comes in a little round cup that looks a lot like a mite-wash cup. So that's what I use because they're readily available for me.
Nice. I'll have to look for it in the freezer. Randy noticed that the colors for Harbo 3 and 0 were reversed between slides A and B. Is that an error in the presentation of the results? It probably was an error in the coloration. Yes. Ruth commented she picked up one of the breeder queens that we made available and said hers is looking good with her brood pattern. I'm glad to hear that. It makes me feel tingly and fuzzy inside. Buzz, I need you to send me your address for your pin test via email, please. Would you like to comment on virus levels in VSH colonies? Now, I did some research or looked into this because I wanted to find a way to include that information in the presentation. But that would turn into a whole other presentation in and of itself. What I can say based on the information that I know is available is that colonies that consistently show low mite loads or tolerance of low mite loads in the colonies consistently had lower viral titers. So they were able to determine in some of these feral colonies that they had a much lower prevalence of the deformed wing virus. And you'll hear some folks say, if you're advocating for tolerance, like I would advocate for tolerance, that, there can be colonies that survive with high varroa load or high varroa infestation. And those mites just don't have the viruses that frequently, debilitate our northern colonies. So they would be able to survive with, a higher level of mites, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7%, if there's no deformed wing virus or other viruses being vectored in the colony. When you use the swirl dawn method after making your initial count Have you put the sample back into the wash and tried shaking for 15 seconds and then recounting to see if your swirl method is adequate? Yeah, so that's in the picture I showed at the end of the presentation there. And maybe that question came before I said it.
It
I
did.
have started doing that, so that way I make sure that I get 0 on the second wash, because there'll be folks that'll say, you know, well, how do you know that the first count was accurate? And I want to be able to answer them that, you know, I retested it.
I've read where they shake for 15 seconds, do a sample count, put it back in, shake for another 15 seconds, do a sample count again, and then do it one more time, just to reassure themselves that they're getting an accurate count. They use the same soapy water. They don't replace it either.
Yeah, if there's not a lot of debris in the water, right? Or if I have time to refilter it, like I will, but I'll be honest with you. When I'm out in the bee yard, I've got like 10 boxes open and kids texting me like right now asking me to unlock tablets, and I'm just like, I ain't got time. I ain't got time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for coming, and glad you're here. Thanks for the question. Chris said he did an experiment on 92 hives last August. 54 had less than 9 mites on September 1 and did not treat. By October 1st, 25 had over 3% and missed a crucial treatment period. So he's lowering his treatment threshold to 1 and 2% this year. I can't remember. Did you do Harbo assays on those colonies, Chris? Buzz said, I'm in an area with high influx of colonies for wintering. While my colonies have higher mite levels, reinfesting is high. However, my survival level is high and hive health is good, while my friend's non-VSH queens hive health is poor and 90% loss. Yeah, it'd be nice to get some tighter levels on your bees too.
Hey, James.
Yes.
I was going back to the previous comment or question from Chris, talking about how he'd seen a rise in his wash levels between September, and so he's changed his threshold. Something I think one can consider there, or should consider, is that if you've been testing throughout the summer, June, July, August, September, and these colonies, your records show, stayed at that low level and then suddenly rose in October. Well, I don't know where he's located, but if there's a heck of a lot less capped brood later in the season, those mites are going to come out and they're going to be detected on the bodies of the bees. You don't actually necessarily have more mites. You're just washing more mites because they're there to be washed. And like you suggested, you got to go to something like Harbo to really get those answers.
Right, but if you're just sticking with just the wash as a threshold indicator, like that might be a good way to establish. I mean, at least it's something, and you're developing a consistent approach.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that I think that those colonies, if they'd been consistently low until that 30-day period, in my case, I would have let them go through the winter and see if they survived and how they came out. I think that might have just been a temporary bump due to the reduction in brood.
So that's also something I probably should include, right? But we can't always include everything. You got to be able to make the call based on what you're seeing in the brood too. Because by the time you get down into that brood nest to get your sample, you're getting a good look at how much cap brood is in the colony. So that can also give you a little bit of insight. And again, it gets harder to retain, like how much of that data you can use to make your decisions when you're dealing with a lot of colonies. But it's definitely a factor that plays a role. I don't have a lot of hard data or evidence to say, hey, you should employ this as a method. But I have found colonies that I sample at the end of August, sometimes even in September, when they have those higher thresholds and the brood has wound down. It's clear that there's much less brood. That 5% was not a real big problem for me.
Right.
Those colonies did survive.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. Yep.
And I think I might have had one that was at 14%, and it was at the end of August. But see, now here's the thing. Last August was very different than the August preceding it. And so this is a factor because our season was longer in Michigan last year. It stayed warmer longer. There was more brood longer into the end of the season. And so the year before, the brood was much lower at that time. So these are all things that we have to, and that's kind of stuff that comes from advanced beekeeping, I guess you would say, like it's part of, as you grow as a beekeeper, you learn to start looking for that stuff or being mindful of that stuff. But the August preceding, there was no brood in the colony, and the mite wash is 14%. It's different than if it's 14% and there's 10 frames of brood.
That's true. Yep. Yep.
Good point, Randy, that you bring up about the time and the brood versus available bees with varroa mites on them. With 92 hives, Chris probably could have also, considering isolating 10 of them and changing his threshold for 10 of them just to see how they wintered.
Right. Yep. I mean, my experience is showing me that if the same queen, if her colony, month after month after month of mite washes done with the same methodology, June, July, August, looking good, looking good, looking good. I find that I don't need to get concerned about a little bit of a late season bump when the brood, the capped brood is greatly reduced.
Yep.
I hang in there, and it's worked out for me okay so far.
Well, there's quite a bit of a discussion about UBO going. I won't open that can of worms. Any information on Greenlight Biosciences RNA treatment to vaccinate bees for mite resistance? It's probably a good thing, but for me, I'm looking at the cost factor, right? And then I'm looking at selection protocols. Like I feel like I can put as much work into selecting as I'm going to have to employ vaccinated bees. I mean, like, so where's the trade-offs in the labor, I think is going to be the significant role player there.
Do you know what the cost is of that Greenlight Biosciences?
Well, Amber Leach says that they are at EAS. So Amber, do you know how much they're charging?
I don't think that they have their pricing set yet, but it's going to be ridiculously expensive. I think that for now, Man Lake's going to be the only distributor that carries it, that they don't have any yet because it hasn't received full approval. But it is, I've talked to him a few times this week, and it's going to be crazy expensive.
Thanks, Amber.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Like, is it approachable? And that kind of goes a little bit back to like, the point James was making earlier about, what do we use to determine whether or not we sling in queens, and a $20, $25, $30 virgin, with potential for genetics based on historical data is a far cheaper investment with a higher upside than an expensive intervention like a RNAi or what's the other Dalen vaccine. Like these things are investments that may be effective, but are they approachable methods for the general public or general beekeeping by and large? And can it be replicated at a higher scale so we're benefiting the whole entire population of honeybees as a whole unit of beekeepers, because there's more hobbyists and sideliners than there are commercial beekeepers, and so until there's a equalization of the genetics, we're not going to tip the scale. And it's not to villainize any one particular side. Both markets, hobbyists and commercial markets, are determined based on demand. So until the supply can equal demand and vice versa, we're going to continue to have to climb uphill. So. I think I did get everybody's questions. Anybody else have any other questions or comments or concerns?
Well, one
This
thing,
was,
one
that
thing
it
I-
was new.
Go ahead.
Okay, Bud.
You're commenting on survival and low mite rates, but where we are, we get, I get a neighbor maybe brings 1,000 hives for wintering. And so it's very, very late. Of course, my hives are going to get higher influx of mites, but the survival rate's so much better. So sometimes we focus on the mite counts and stuff. But if you're in an area that has high influx of commercial beekeepers in winter there, then you're obviously your mites are going to go up. And the only way I can survive is to have VHS queens. because the mite level all summer is low. And when the stuff comes in in fall, then they have some protection. I just think that's also part of you have to sort of put that in the view of why VHS queens are good. Can you hear me?
Yes, we heard you. I was thinking of I was going to make a comment about Betamax versus VHS.
And the gash in his chest.
All right. Well, if there's no further questions or comments, I appreciate everybody coming, and thanks for everybody that supported the presentation tonight, and all those that on a regular basis support the SBGMI. We've come a long way, and we've had a really effective reach. Thanks to all of you. It's not just, any one person's efforts that have kind of gotten us to this point. And we're really happy to see the results, and I just hope that it continues into the future. And that more and more beekeepers keep on doing these things that are promoting this message of sustainable beekeeping through resistance breeding and reduced treatments. All right. Everybody have a good night. We'll see
Thank
you
you,
soon.
James.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.